Hello and welcome to another of PAVE's weekly panel discussions. This week, we have a very important topic, how the public sector is preparing for autonomous vehicles. This week's panel is accompanying the announcement of our Public Sector Advisory Council. And both of our guests are members of that council. I'm very, very proud and honored to say. First up from Colorado DOT, and now the chair of our Public Sector Advisory Council, we have Nylen. Ashley, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, PAVE, for having me. Very excited to be here today.
And from the city of Chandler, Arizona, we have Economic Development Director, Micah Miranda. Micah, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Ed.
So I'm really excited to have you both here today. You both represent sort of different levels of government that have to be involved in the deployment of autonomous vehicles. And I wanted to sort of set the stage a little bit for this discussion by asking each of you to sort of talk about the first time that you started thinking about autonomous vehicles in your role, as a public servant. Ashley, if we could start with you.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Ed. So I've been involved in autonomous vehicles since about 2014. I recently joined CDOT in 2018, actually, toward the end of it. So prior to my arrival, CDOT actually already had a dedicated program to connect in autonomous technologies, and that had sort of stood up since 2017. So those early stages of the program focused on connecting automated vehicles, understanding CDOT's role in deployment of those vehicles, and really enabling an environment where those vehicles could thrive as they became available. Today, our program is I would call it very mature. It's termed the Mobility Technology Program. It sits within what's known as the Office of Innovative Mobility, and my program sort of leads the strategy, the principles, and the deployment when it comes to that technology. We also work with a few of our other state agencies, which I'll talk about here a bit later, on a task force known as the Autonomous Mobility Task Force in Colorado that oversees the deployment of vehicles that meet a certain definition, which we'll get to here in a bit. But for Colorado, we've had sort of dedicated program staff since about 2017.
All right, and Micah?
From the city of Chandler perspective, we approached it a little bit differently. Our initial foray into AV wasn't so much on the transportation aspect, but more from how can we participate at an early level for the commercialization of this technology as a way to further diversify and enhance our economy. We have a long history in advanced manufacturing, semiconductors, engineering, and so this coupled with the 5G rollouts we were experiencing back in 2014, 2015, we really started to look at it from that perspective and how it could really further economic development, not just across Chandler, but across the whole greater Phoenix region. So that's how we took our first approach to it. I thought about it more from an economics perspective as opposed from a transportation perspective.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I also, because we're an educational organization here at PAVE, and because one of the main roles for the Public Sector Advisory Council is to sort of further spread education about this technology. And I've personally found in my experience with this technology that you just never stop learning, right? There's just always more to learn. I'm just curious if maybe either of you could share sort of some of where you maybe go to learn about this stuff. Do you have sort of formalized things as part of your programs or departments, or is that more of a personal thing? Anything you could share about how you sort of stay up on this?
I'll go ahead and take a first stab. I'm both personally and very professionally interested in sort of technology broadly and specifically emerging technology and how it can improve the safety and efficiency of our transportation system. Now, within my program, we have just a plethora of sort of national efforts that we participate in fairly heavily, I would say. Everything from AASHTO groups, there's a community of practice for practitioners like myself, TRB committees, all kinds of working groups around standards. And those really are, I would say, advancing the field for those that are, looking at ways that we can deploy technology, prepare for it. It really sort of provides that good footing of collaboration among others that are going through some of the very same lessons that we are, and also opens a door for information sharing. So if you're not in any sort of those groups that I mentioned, I am more than happy to pass on those resources. And I know a number of my other public sector counterparts on the council also participate in all kinds of groups. So I would say, you know, do not hesitate to tap those. Even if you feel that you're sort of a newcomer, there's just a plethora of knowledge in all of those groups.
Yeah, I like to really work with the early stage R&D teams that are looking at this technology, understanding where they see this technology driving. So really working with the engineers looking to bring this forward at a organizational level, but then also at an individual level. I feel like that's where a lot of the innovation's coming from, and they'll say something probably 12 to 18 months prior to being mainstream as to, hey, this is what's coming. And sure enough, 12 months later, it's starting to be talked about. So really talking to those engineers that are working to solve these problems is where I like to invest a lot of my time. And then internationally, a lot of our partners in Asia and Europe specifically have taken some policy approaches to autonomous vehicles that I like to keep tabs on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you know, as you're being involved in, you know, really the only fully driverless deployment in the United States. I mean, I'm sure you're just learning all the time, just through involvement in that, things that will be really valuable for you know, other folks in similar positions to be able to learn from. Ashley, you mentioned a task force, a statewide task force that Colorado has. I know this is something that a number of states have done. Why is this approach so popular? What has it done for Colorado?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. And I will say, you know, there are different sort of frameworks around a task force or committee. I've observed that some of them can be more sort of policy focused in nature. Some may be more deployment focused in nature. And really, I think that reflects sort of where your state or jurisdiction is at in terms of what works for you. Some have sort of both, or they have working groups that sort of report to both. In Colorado's instance, we have what's termed as the Autonomous Mobility Task Force, and that is focused on deployment of vehicles that want to come test in Colorado. So back in 2017, we had a Senate bill that passed that really set up the framework for CDOT to sort of build this process that if a vehicle does not comply with a federal, local, or state standard, or it removes the human completely, the manufacturer, tester, or startup, or what have you, has to go in front of this task force. The process is completely outlined on our website, and there's an application that they have to do. There's all kinds of information that's provided around the operational design domain, the deployment, liability, all of those sort of things that you would expect. And that application gets sent to our task force. And the task force members feature CDOT, so the Colorado Department of Transportation is the chair. We have the Colorado State Patrol, since they sort of oversee and regulate our roadways. And then lastly, the Department of Revenue. And like a number of my other states, our motor vehicle division is over in our Department of Revenue. So that's why DOR sits at the board there, or sits on the chair there. And really that application comes to our task force, and we have a process where we evaluate the safety of that deployment. Knowing that a number of our deployments to date, or applicants, I should say, that have come to the task force do end up residing in various jurisdictions, we very much encourage, and in most instances, the tester has actually already reached out to that jurisdiction that they're testing in. So for example, Denver, Westminster, Lone Tree, whatever town it might be in or jurisdiction, they are very much engaged in that process as well. And the jurisdiction is welcome to utilize our process as they see fit, or they can, you know, sort of go the route that they may need as well.
Yeah, and Micah, sort of from the city level perspective, I imagine having, you know, good communication and collaboration with the state level is really important. How does that happen in Arizona, and what has that done for you?
Yeah, so Arizona Department of Transportation, as well as the governor's office, are very engaged in support of the deployment of this technology. So a lot of that interface happens at that level, but from a practical testing deployment perspective, it's really our public safety professionals out on the street. So think police and fire working with the state officials to really come up with practical solutions because they're the ones that are having the most interaction. So think about where these vehicles are really spending the bulk of their time. They're on municipal roads and streets. And so the number one thing from the city of Chandler's perspective is the safety perspective. So what information are our police officers and firefighters gathering in real time and then feeding back to the policymakers at the state and local levels to provide good guidance on how to support this technology in a user-friendly and community safety perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And Micah, I want to stay with you for a second here. We have a bunch of questions from the audience about infrastructure. You know, I know there's a lot of different perspectives on this, and I'm kind of curious, sort of, you know, again, from the perspective of dealing with really the first pioneering fully driverless deployment in the U.S. How important has infrastructure been to that? What were sort of the needs, and what was the sort of level of investment that was required to make that happen?
You know, our perspective is, you know, we really don't want to have to make any infrastructure changes to accommodate these vehicles. I think most of the technology companies out there really don't want to go that route also. It's not really a cost-effective method for cities, municipalities, governments to be tearing up roads, whatever the infrastructure may be, to allow for different types of technology. So our approach has really been to think about how the built environment is going to interact with these vehicles. So one of the things that we've done in City of Chandler is we launched the first development standards around autonomous vehicle pickup and loading. So starting to think about, you know, if you're a retail center, a hospital, an office building, from a design element, what can we do to allow for these vehicles to ingress and egress effectively? We've also taken a look at how we can reduce our parking standards and allow for them to be repurposed in other ways. So from a roadway infrastructure perspective, we're really not looking to make significant changes now or even in the immediate future because there's so many competing technologies that could potentially be out there. So we're really taking a hands-off approach and looking to work with those providers who don't need that level of investment from the city to support, you know, whatever they're looking to do.
Yeah, that pickup and drop-off issue is a really interesting one. I know when I got a ride in a fully driverless Waymo that they were talking about that a lot, and it was something that really hadn't been in the discourse. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. Ashley, from a state level perspective, so how do you think about infrastructure, and maybe what are you hearing from companies that want to deploy about what they might want or need or not?
Yeah, a good question. And I would say broadly, you know, I would agree with all the points that Micah raised. And one thing I would add on to that, and we talk about this quite a bit, you know, the infrastructure improvements that are good for a highly automated vehicle are also going to be good for our human drivers. And knowing that we have, you know, the penetration rates of nearly 100% of our human drivers out there, understanding that larger, you know, larger lane strips, more signage, all of those things that are good for an AV are going to be good for our human drivers. So to the extent that we can make those upgrades, we do. Now, with that being said, you know, we have so many competing resources. We have so many lane miles here in Colorado, as do our other states. So at the end of the day, you know, we have to make sure that we're making those maintenance and operation improvements that are needed for our folks to traverse. You know, and also we know that the same sort of improvements that we make, those are also going to benefit human drivers today that also have advanced driver assistance systems. So all of those things, you know, are good. I would also agree that largely, you know, the deployments that we see, they are sort of preparing for the vehicle or the roadways as they know it today. So understanding that our pavement markings and that our pavement is imperfect. You know, there's no way I think any DOT is going to be able to have all of their lane miles in sort of perfect condition, right? So I think I would say the testers have done a wonderful job of recognizing that and preparing their systems to deal with those sort of scenarios and situations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that often comes as a big surprise that the things that are one of, some of the improvements that are best for AVs are also the ones that are just best for drivers too, and that there's a real win-win there. Micah, again, you've been on, you're sort of on the leading edge of some of this stuff, particularly with the driverless part of it, which really does, I think sometimes people don't realize what a difference that does make in terms of some of the first responder things you were talking about, versus having a deployment where you still have a safety driver behind the wheel. What has there been anything that has sort of particularly surprised you, or that just kind of was not something that you necessarily anticipated about this, that sort of come up and been an interesting thing to deal with?
Yeah, there's been a couple of things, both on the technology side as well as the community side. So, we're a very public facing organization. City of Chandler, our residents are very engaged with what goes on. I was initially most surprised with how excited and supportive our community was to this new technology testing. Our partners came out whenever they're looking to do something. They hold community forums. They get folks comfortable with what's going on. So I was really excited to see that Chandler residents could be early adopters of this technology, and we're more than welcoming of it. The other thing that stood out was the economic development opportunities. We always thought that there was a play there, and we were obviously correct, but just how wide and deep it goes into a lot of the existing supply chains is tremendous. And so not only just a transportation tool, but really an economic development tool for the city and state. And that hasn't been lost upon the residents of Chandler, at least, that, this is something that can help advance our overall economy and quality of life.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ashley, has been something that sort of emerged in your work that's been surprising, or maybe a challenge you didn't expect?
Not necessarily a challenge I wouldn't expect or surprising, but I think one thing that I've noticed, consistently since 2014 is just the continuing need to get information out and reaching our consumers. I mean, I think, there's a lot of overhype in this technology. There's a lot of overpromise, and frankly, consumers don't normally get past a headline. So finding ways that we can get the right messaging out there, and that, there's not this misconception or potential mistrust, I think is a very, very important element for, both the government and the private sector, to make sure that we can, when the market penetration's there, that we can really sort of thrive on that. At the DOT, we see technology, both, technology that's out there today and highly automated vehicles, sort of offering a significant opportunity to increase safety. And knowing how many fatalities and injuries we have on our roadway, we want to make sure that that technology can thrive. But if we have sort of this misconception and mistrust out there, we may never be able to get out there. So I think that's something that continues to be a challenge. And, I think that's one reason that we're very excited to participate in the public sector group with PAVE.
Yeah, and no, it's a fantastic point, and actually it applies really well to a couple of questions we've gotten from actually everyone from Uber ATG to a Chandler citizen, which all sort of revolve around this question of how much information do you need to know about the safety performance of these vehicles, and I think that, some folks are interested in this generically, and some people even want to know about the driverless specifically. How do you know when you're going to feel comfortable? So what kind of data sharing do you have in place, or what do you need to feel that a driverless deployment is going to be safe?
I can start. So we're fortunate in Colorado, as I said earlier, we have the process with our Autonomous Mobility Task Force. So we do have that threshold of requirements that we request. Now, of course, it does come up very commonly. What has the tester done before? What can they point to? What are their safety protocols? So while there's not just sort of a blanket answer, I think the more that you can show or illustrate as a tester or deployment that's showing sort of your safety conscious and sort of your safety culture, I think that's going to resonate very well with the government that you're working with, and particularly the folks that might be in your vehicle.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
what Ashley said is spot on. I think there might be some misconceptions out there amongst the general public, which it will ultimately stunt the adoption of this technology. But it's not the Wild West when it comes to putting these vehicles on the streets. There's a lot of due diligence and conversations around the safety of the vehicle. So it is very much at the forefront of a lot of different government entities as well as the private sector's minds. They don't want to put anything out there that could jeopardize the public's trust in the development and ultimate deployment of this technology.
Yeah, and sort of on a similar level, and you know, what seems to be emerging here is a theme of kind of relationships, right? And if a relationship is going well, then you build confidence in it, and you sort of move forward. And it seems like because this technology is so complex, it can be, you know, that's kind of the way you have to sort of build that confidence. But one of the attendees asks, do you think there should be efforts to create a registration system for companies to test connected autonomous vehicles, or is there a different focus that you'd recommend? Ashley?
Sure, I can start with that. So within our process here in Colorado, we do have a mechanism to know if the vehicle is, you know, if it's gone through our process, and that's with the Department of Revenue, since they do sort of our motor vehicle records. Now, a nationwide nationwide registration system, I think there'd probably have to be a lot of conversation around what that looks like, you know, what the requirements are, what we're achieving. You know, certainly I think that there has been some effort in the industry to sort of get towards sort of standards around safety and all of those things. So I think it's certainly a possibility, but you know, right now we sort of have to work at the state and jurisdiction level based on sort of what their requirements are.
Micah?
No, I completely agree with Ashley. I mean, that was spot on from my perspective.
Yeah. Well, you know, it would not. We are running, getting close to time here, but it would not be a Zoom webinar in 2020 if I did not ask something COVID related. And we do have a question about that from the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, and they want to know how has the COVID pandemic impacted how you're preparing for or talking about autonomous vehicles in any way? You shifting focus from this human mobility aspect to delivery, or are you seeing that in terms of the sort of incoming interest that you are receiving? And Michael, let's start with you with your sort of on the ground deployment.
Yeah, so on the delivery side, that was a lot of the conversations we've been having with providers prior to COVID, really looking to solve that last mile challenge that we so often see in you know, ordering goods online. You know, how can that be done more effectively, safer, looking at it from both a larger region perspective, city, and then really narrowing down into a specific neighborhood. How can that technology, you know, serve as another distribution point to speed up the delivery of goods? From a testing and deployment perspective, I think COVID has really it's slowed the new rollout in the sense of, you know, we're not putting, or the companies aren't putting people in vehicles until this issue passes. But from the technology refinement side, I know that they're spending a lot of time really optimizing and looking to improve upon the accuracy of the data and information and the mapping in their systems to provide a better service for customers. So just because all the vehicles aren't on the road and the consumers aren't using them, the providers are really improving the technology and their performance in a more private fashion.
Absolutely. Ashley?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, broadly, you know, not unlike other DOTs, we're still sort of understanding what the long-term effects are going to be, specifically in the public transit sphere when it comes to COVID. You know, certainly social distancing sort of changes what your vehicles look like, or what sort of occupancy looks like, and all of those things. And I think it's just going to take time to really understand sort of those effects. I will say in May, so still during, you know, quarantine, our Autonomous Mobility Task Force was able to assemble very quickly to actually evaluate and approve an operation for an AV shuttle to transport food for a food bank operation. So from the timing of, NHTSA approval and our task force approval, we had that done in a week. So it was really great to see sort of all those different government agencies come together very quickly. And certainly we've done that before, but, just to know that when we are sort of faced with an emergency, sort of rallying the troops and getting something for the greater good, it was really great to see that process move so swiftly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've all seen sort of how people seeing, AVs out there actually doing some good in the world has really been a good thing for the technology. Just to wrap up, Micah, if you had advice to another city that, was either, interested trying to get an autonomous deployment, or maybe even had some inbound interest from a developer, what would be sort of the one piece of advice that you would leave them with? Or it could be a couple. We don't have a ton of time.
I guess so a couple pieces of advice. So if you're a community and you're wanting to work on attracting a tester, is really try and get a sense of where your community's at and the acceptance of this technology. You don't want to be forcing something that your community may not just be comfortable with yet. So you would waste a lot of time with no results there. The other thing I would say from a kind of municipal, even state perspective is, really get the feedback from the professionals who are interacting with these vehicles on a daily basis. They have so much information to share. They're happy to lend their time and give you that advice and perspective. Like Chandler Fire literally wrote the book on how to respond to an autonomous vehicle incident. Fortunately, we've been very safe in that regards, but having these professionals give feedback and work collaboratively with the testers and providers is the way to go. And it really goes towards developing a stronger relationship and ultimately helping to aid in the commercialization of the technology quicker.
Absolutely. And Ashley, what advice would you give to other state level officials?
Sure. I would absolutely echo what Micah said. I think the relationship building and collaboration and sort of learning from others is really key. I would also say, start with the problem that you're trying to solve. In our scenario, it's around safety. We want to enhance safety. That's sort of core to our DOT and of course other DOTs, and also sort of enhance mobility. So, look at those sort of problems you're trying to solve, identify the elements that technology can sort of help or aid or what have you. And then, look to what your capacity is. If you're sort of in the early stages, perhaps working with some of those groups that I mentioned earlier, reaching out to other entities that might be farther along. I think those are all sort of things that can kind of build your capacity and sort of help you down the line of technology, because we know it's going to be sort of broad sometime here soon. We don't know when, but I think there are some things that people can do even with limited resources and budgets to sort of prepare now.
Absolutely. Well, that just about takes us to time. I want to take a moment to just thank our guests for not just being here today, but also for joining our Public Sector Advisory Council. As I think everyone got a chance to see today, your expertise is really just impressive, and we really are so excited to leverage that and share it with the other public sector officials out there who are preparing for the autonomous future. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having
Bye,
us.
everyone.
And thank you to our audience as well for taking the time to join us today. It's actually been wonderful to see the turnout. We have public officials from across the country at all different levels here. We really hope that this panel has been useful to you, and we really hope that our Public Sector Advisory Council will also be useful to you as well. We will be discussing these issues more in the future, both here on our weekly panel series. In case you couldn't tell, I think any of these questions we probably could have done a whole panel on just one of them. And so we will definitely be doing more of that in the future, as well as later in this year. We will be doing a public sector workshop, which will be sort of like this, but in a more private and non-public setting, so just for public sector employees. So thank you all for being here. We hope that this has been enjoyable and useful to you, and we look forward to seeing you next week on another PAVE panel discussion.